Well, good morning. Happy Easter, everybody. Glad to see you. My name is Peter. I'm the pastor here at Hope City Church. Listen, I want to just say, if it's your first time here at Hope City, we're glad that you're here. We're even more excited that you've chosen to celebrate Easter Sunday with us. We recognize you could be anywhere right now, but today you're here at Hope City, and it's going to be an incredible day to be together. Now, we've been in the midst of a series this past month called Walls, and today we're going to be taking a look at one more wall, or in this case, it's actually more of a curtain today, but we're going to be talking about that this morning. See, Easter is one of those days, it's one of those moments where in order to get to some of the really good parts of Easter, we've got to go through some of the more difficult days or darker moments of Easter. Here at Hope City, we are celebrating the fact on Easter Sunday that Jesus died on the cross, that he was buried in a real tomb, and that on the third day, Easter Sunday, he rose from the dead, and that he defeated death and sin, and he had created a life that is filled with hope for you and for me. But this week, as I was wondering, thinking about this message and getting prepared for Easter Sunday and everything that God is going to be doing here today, we decided that I would spend some time talking about some of the last words of Jesus. So some of the last words that he said while here on earth before he was crucified. And so while we know what those words are, because of what is written in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, I started to wonder, what would my last words be, right? So what would my last words be here on earth? And so I like to, I'm kind of a handy guy. I like to fix things around the house. I like to do some improvements around my house and all those kinds of things. And so I figure, I'm almost positive. My last words would be, I'd be on top of a tall ladder, changing a chandelier in my house. And my last words would just literally be whoops. That would be it. And it would be over. It would be curtains for me, right? You've heard that phrase where somebody draws a curtain. It's a theatrical term. It's curtains for your character. Basically defines every single character on the blacklist. I don't know if you know that, but every character that comes on that show is written off basically within the same exact episode. But so there's actually one other time where I literally thought it was curtains for me. I was about 26, I think. This is a picture of my family and I. So this is my wife, Tiffany, my oldest son, Noah, my daughter, Grace, and then our youngest, Leah. And so when I was 26, we didn't have all those kids when I was 26, by the way. But we had two of them at the time, and Grace especially was my middle child. She was just about 18 months when this happened. She was 18 months old, and she came down with the rotavirus. Anybody familiar with the rotavirus? It's awful. It's terrible. It is absolutely heartbreaking to see your child suffer with something like that. She was, like I said, 18 months, so in a crib, and you would walk in her room, and she'd be taking a nap, and you would just find her in her mess and in her filth. She just couldn't hold down any food. It was coming out in every direction possible. And so my wife, Tiffany, is the greatest mom in the world. Seriously, she's an amazing mom, an amazing mom to these three kids. And she just was caring for her. We had to bring Grace to the hospital 2 different times because she was so dehydrated. It was bad, real bad. And so, at the end of this, she's cleaning up after her, and, she's exhausted, the way that only moms can be exhausted. Any moms in the room understand what mom exhaustion is? Some of you are shaking your head. It's okay. You can say, yes, it's me. I understand it. Us dads, we get a cold, and we're out for, a month. You moms, I don't know how you do it, but you do it. And so, anyway, she was taking care of Gracie for, a solid week and a half. She's exhausted, and she comes in after cleaning her up one last time, comes into the bathroom, and finds me laying like a little chihuahua curled up on that little bath mat, right in front of the sink, and I'm clutching my stomach. And I hear the door open up, and I do everything I can. I muster all the strength within my power just to look up and kind of squint with one of my eyes, and I look at her and I say, I think I'm going to die. I'm telling you, this is the most compassionate woman in the world. I look at her and I go, I got to go to the hospital. I think I'm going to die. She gathers everything that she has. She looks down at me, as only a wife can, and says, get back in bed. Pull it together. Right? For real. I thought I was done. I thought, this is it. This is the moment. This is the time when it is all over. But see, here's what I know. I know this, you know this, we all know this, that there is a reality in life that's called pain and suffering. Pain is real. Suffering is real. In fact, that story that I shared with you is minuscule in comparison to some of the things that you're experiencing, have experienced, or maybe even will experience. I know that some of you in this room, you feel the pain of abandonment. Maybe this is a pain of abandonment by a spouse or a parent, or by a best friend, by maybe even a company that you've given the best years of your life to. You know, you've poured your life into this company. And all of a sudden, you walk in one day, and they use words like downsizing or divorce or you're just too much drama, and then it's done, and you would define it as it's curtains for you. It's done. Others of you in the room, you know, you would say that you felt hurt or abused. You know, maybe in lots of different ways, different forms. Some of you have been verbally abused, and you just can't shake that voice that's going on inside of your head, that voice that you still hear that says, you're not enough, you're not pretty enough, you're not strong enough, you're not intelligent enough, you're not satisfying enough. And that voice just plays over and over and over again, and you feel as if a curtain has been drawn somewhere in your life, something separating you. Some of you are in physical pain. You wake up every single day. You struggle to get out of bed because of the pain that you're experiencing. And listen, I understand that in the pain of your body, maybe it's self-inflicted pain, whether that's by chasing after the next high, or bringing the next fling into your bed, or maybe even physically harming yourself. Whatever it may be, there are times in life when it becomes so painful and it just feels as if there's a curtain. Have you ever questioned God in the midst of your pain? Like in the moment when you just feel overwhelmed in pain, by pain, that you would say something like this. Maybe you have even said this in the last week. You would say the question, God, why? God, why? Like, where are you? Or have you left me, kind of hung out to dry and I feel empty? Like, where are you in my life? See, the other thing that we know that's true about life is that life hits us where it hurts, when it hurts. And the thing that I love is that today we get to talk about that because Jesus faced that head on. In fact, we're going to look at one of the last words that Jesus said here on earth this morning. And he spoke these words while he was hanging on a cross in the midst of incredible pain. This morning, if you brought Bibles with you, I want to invite you to turn to Matthew chapter 27. If you didn't, no worries. We printed on the notes inside of your program, and you can follow along on the screen behind me as well. See, at this point in time, Matthew is writing the story. He's writing the story of Jesus, his time that he spent here on earth. And what he's writing is that so you and I would have a picture of what it looks like to be in pain. See, these religious leaders, the Jewish religious leaders at the time, accused Jesus of being a liar, being a political activist, and being one who was leading a rebellion to overthrow everything that they had worked for to establish. And they crucified him for it. But let's look at what Jesus has to say while he was hanging on the cross. In verse chapter 27, verse 45, it says, "From noon until 3 p.m, darkness came over all the land. And about 3 p.m, Jesus cried out in a loud voice. He says, 'Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani,' which means, my God, why have you forsaken me?" See, Jesus is hanging on a cross with nails pierced in his hands and in his feet. And what does he do? He says, "God, why?" Right? Like he comes to this moment and he says, "God, why?" This is one of the most haunting questions of all the Gospels, right? Because in this statement, he's saying like, "God, what's going on?" And so you and I, we have to ask the question, like, does Jesus not know what's going on? Like, does he not know the answer? Does he not understand cognitively what's taking place and with his physical torture and execution? No, of course not. Of course he understands. Because he's fully God, means he's fully divine. He knows everything. But in the same time, in the same breath, Jesus is also fully man, which means he experienced everything, the emotions, the pain. He knew everything, and he was experiencing it all too well. Have you ever asked yourself a question even though you know the answer? Right? Like maybe it was the day that you lost your job. You lost your job and then you were like, "God, why? Why did this happen?" And you know why it happened, right? Like your company wasn't performing well in the last quarter. They were downsizing. You saw friends that lost their job and it just sort of makes sense, right? But something making sense just isn't good enough in pain, right? And so we're left asking questions like, God, why? See, a few years ago, I got a call. I'll never forget this phone call that I got. I got a call from one of my sisters, and she told me about my youngest sister, and she said, she's being rushed to the hospital right now. She's in labor. Well, so here's the problem, is that she was only 22 months along in her term. And so my older sister said to me about my younger sister, she said, Peter, you need to pray. Just pray. It was a few hours later that I got a text message with a picture that my nephew Will was born, weighing just under 16 ounces, 22 weeks old. And this picture was beautiful. It was perfect. You know, he looked like every newborn that you've ever wanted to see. You know, without any perspective, without somebody holding him, or without putting it next to, anything in that emergency room, you wouldn't know that this child had any problems. See, he looked healthy. He looked strong. He had 10 fingers, 10 toes. He looked perfect, but his insides were just racked with pain. See, cognitively, I knew what was going on. But my emotions couldn't keep up with what was happening, because just 18 hours later, my sister and her husband had to withdraw life support and say goodbye to their precious baby boy. I knew that his lungs were very underdeveloped. I knew that the statistics were horrible against him. And I knew that the chances were very, very slim that he was going to make it. But my heart, it was feeling something totally different. And some of you know exactly what I'm talking about, because you've gone through something where your mind knows one thing, but your heart feels something totally different. And so in Mark chapter 14, we get another picture of what Jesus is feeling even before he's hanging on a cross. In the Garden of Gethsemane, Jesus was with his disciples, and he's with his best friends, and he says to them, my soul is overwhelmed. My soul is overwhelmed. Have you ever been to the place where you're just like, I can't take one more thing, right? That's what it is. My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death, he said to them. Stay here and keep watch. And so going a little further, he fell to the ground and prayed that if possible, the hour might pass from him. Abba, Father, he says, everything's possible for you. Take this cup from me. Yet not what I will, but what you will. See, in this scripture, in this verse, this one verse, we understand that it wasn't the splinters of the cross that made Jesus cry out. It was the tearing of his soul. It was that relational pain. See, Jesus is the Son of God, who's been in an eternal relationship with God the Father. Yet here on the cross, for the very first time, there's a separation. There's a curtain that's drawn between God the Father and God the Son in Jesus. And he says, God, why? See, you and I, we love to focus on the physical pain. On Easter, we love to talk about how Jesus was crucified and how this was the worst way to die, that the Romans figured out how to inflict the most pain. We talk about the nails and the whipping and the blood being poured out and all this. We think about that. But this is actually a cry of deep emotional pain, heartache. This is the tearing of a relationship between a father and a son who up until this point in time had lived in perfect relational harmony. And see, our sins, the things that we do, our way rather than God's way, it's put on the shoulders of Jesus, and it separated him from God's presence. That curtain was drawn. It felt like, I can't experience what I used to have. See, this is what sin does. Sin actually separates us from God. Sin keeps it blocks us from experiencing God in a real way. And Jesus took this sin upon himself. He became sin who knew no sin. That's what Scripture tells us. And anytime that you and I look at the cross, we should see our sin there with him. So when you look at a cross, when you see, a gold cross on a necklace, when you see a cross in front of a church somewhere, you should see the things that you and I have done, the things that I've done, put Jesus there. It wasn't any one person. It was what we've done to go against God. And it was our sin that tore Jesus from his Father's side. In the Old Testament, the Hebrew Scriptures, God's presence was found in the temple. This is obviously a picture, a mock-up of what it could be like. If you pay really close attention, you'll see an electrical box here that probably didn't exist back then. But you'll know something about this. This is the place where they used to go and they would worship God. The Old Testament, in the Hebrew Scripture, this was their church. In fact, you could say that this was the first portable church, kind of similar to what we do. We set up and tear down every single week, but that's what they did here. They would set up the tent of the temple, and then in the inner court, they had this kind of a smaller place. And inside of that place was something called the Holy of Holies. And so the Holy of Holies was kind of in the center of that tent, and this was the place where God's presence was found. God's presence was found in the Holy of Holies, but there was a problem. And the problem was that sin kept God's presence from everybody else. A literal curtain was drawn between the presence of God and all of the people. Even the people that came into this place to worship, came into this temple, to this church, they were separated from God's presence by a curtain. And listen to this. There's good news. Not great news, but there's good news. And the good news is that one person, once a year, would get to go behind the curtain. One time, once a year, this guy would get to go behind the curtain. He was called the high priest. And the high priest had to go and clean himself up. He had to get himself ready to do this. He had to obey certain dietary laws. He had to do all kinds of things in order to jump through certain hoops to be in God's presence. And here's the problem, is that it definitely wasn't me. It definitely wasn't you. And it was an incredible problem to get into the presence of God because the curtain was up. The walls were up. King David wrote in Psalm 51, verse 11, in the midst of all of his pain and suffering after his sin with Bathsheba, he writes these words. He says, God, do not cast me away from your presence. See, this is a very real thing, to be cut off from the presence of God in David's time. See, what happens when you feel like God has abandoned you? What happens when you feel like God's presence has been cut off from you, or where you can't hear God's voice anymore or feel God's presence? How do you peel back this curtain? See, typically, people go to three possible places. First is we will very often, we'll just kind of look inward. We'll look in at ourselves. If you're taking notes this morning, this is our first point. We look in at ourselves. We begin to kind of navel gaze and look at our own pain and wonder, what's wrong with me, right? And then we say, God, why? The age-old question. See, when Jesus hung on a cross, he said those exact words. And yet on the cross, Jesus gave us permission to question pain. It's okay to ask God why. So this morning, if you came here to church and you're like, I don't go to church, I'm not a churchy person, listen, you're in good company. This is a great place for you to be. But I also want you to hear me say, as the pastor of this church, it's okay for you to ask God why. Like, God, what are you doing? It's okay to ask questions of God and about God. In fact, we're basing an entire series. We're going to spend 4 weeks answering questions or trying to answer questions that you guys may have. And so I want to encourage you to be asking and writing some of those down. See, when I was laying on the floor clutching my stomach, kind of all curled up in pain, you better believe that pain had me wondering. It was like asking questions like, what did I eat? Or even more importantly, like, why did I go to Taco Bell? Like, holy cow, this is like the worst decision ever. Because you know this, I know this, that when we're in pain, it leads us to this kind of deep inner thought. And that pain can cause us to doubt and withdraw. But the problem for you and for me is that when we doubt and withdraw, we remove ourselves from a situation, we actually start to stay inward and we focus on these doubts and questions that our pain has caused. We begin to self-medicate by binging on buffalo wings and blue cheese or shopping our way through pain or watching porn to escape our current reality. When my nephew Will passed away, I got to tell you, that shook me to my core. And in fact, it made me angry with God. It made me angry with myself for the way that I felt about God. I cried for my nephew that I wouldn't get to meet this side of eternity. See, the night that Will was born, I prayed in a way that I don't know that I've ever prayed before, or maybe in a way that I've rarely prayed. In fact, my response to that situation was just so visceral, so aggressive. So I was begging God. I was reminding him of who he was. I was saying, this is who you are, God, and I know what you're capable of. And yet, God seemed silent. See, we have to move beyond that inward focus, because that will never move this curtain. Because just asking the question why will never lead us into the presence of God. A second option, though, that we can do is sometimes we'll turn outward. We can turn to the people that are around us for support and for help. But at times like this, it can also leave us wishing for a little bit more, right? Look back to the scene of the cross with me to see how people respond, how they responded to Jesus. It says in verse 47, when some of those who were standing around, they're standing around the foot of the cross, they heard him say this. He said, when he said, Eli, Eli, they said, oh, he's calling Elijah. And then immediately one of them ran and got a sponge. He filled it with wine vinegar, put it on a staff, and offered it to Jesus to drink. The rest said, nah, leave him alone. Let's see if Elijah comes to save him. See, people respond to others in pain in some very funny ways. Sometimes people try to interpret the situation. And in Jesus' case, they're like, okay, so he says, Eli, Eli. Oh, I got it. He must be calling Elijah. Because why? It sounds like Elijah. But when it comes to you, they'll say things like, hey, you know what? Like, I know what's going on in your world. Listen, if you would just stop smoking, God would, and then you fill in the blanks. Or if you would just give up, drinking so much, God would heal you. I mean, people use if statements like that to interpret what's wrong with you all the time. If you, God would. And I'm telling you, that just isn't the case. Sometimes people offer simple fixes too. Again, Jesus cries out, God, why? And people go, they're like, oh, this guy must be thirsty. Let's get him something to drink. And not just anything to drink. They said, let's get him some wine vinegar. You know what wine vinegar is? It's actually just a mild sedative. So these guys around him, they're like, oh my gosh, he's crying out. Let's go numb his pain, right? He's suffering. Let's go pop a pill. Let's go drink till it doesn't hurt anymore. People say some of the stupidest things to those in pain. It's happened to me. It happens to me more often than you think, where someone will say something and you're like, what? I don't know if you know what you're saying. Like this. Maybe you've heard something like this. Somebody said, hey, what do you think that God's trying to teach you through the loss of your nephew? Great question. What do you think God's trying to teach you through my fist, right? There's that response where you're like, you have no idea what you're saying. This is ridiculous. Stop saying stupid things. See, pain and people in pain cause us to respond in some funny ways. These statements leave you saying, God, why? Why do I feel this way? And it just reaffirms what you already knew, that the curtain is shut, that God isn't there, that you're not able to hear God's voice. You can't experience God's presence. And worst of all, you just feel totally cut off from God and where he is. And it drives you completely mad. It drives you crazy. See, sometimes people just spectate, though. Like these over here, they're like, hey, let's just see if Elijah shows up. Do you got anything else to do? No, let's just stick around and see what happens. We call this people watching. This is when you're like, hey, have you heard about what happened? Did you hear what happened between them? Yeah, I can't believe it. Let's just sit here and let's see what happens. Let's see how this all plays out. And let me tell you that this isn't a remedy for those in pain. When our symptoms get so bad, so overwhelming, you get to the point where you have to go and seek help. And I'm a firm believer of that, of things like counselors, life coaches, the church. As a pastor, I'm here to help you. We exist to help and serve our community. Our team is here to pray with you, and our connect groups are here to walk alongside of you through the challenges of life. And all of these things can be good. In fact, they can even be great. But at the end of the day, I'm just a regular guy. Like, I'm a normal guy. And so I've got tough times too. I've got bad days too, just like you. And I could probably leave you looking for something else or looking for more. Several years ago, there was a guy by the name of Dr. Mike who stumbled into my dad's office. My dad was a pastor as well for about 30 years. And this guy came into my dad's office with tears just running down his face. And he introduced himself. He said, "My name's Dr. Mike, and I need help." And my dad came to find out that just a few days earlier, this guy came home from work one day and found his wife laying face down in the kitchen, having overdosed on some pain meds. And so here's the dilemma. He goes on and he says to my dad, he's like, "Listen, I am the leading pain doctor in the United States. People fly from all over the country for me to treat their physical pain. I don't know you, but I don't know what to do with this kind of pain." He says, "What do I do with this kind of pain?" And see, some of you find yourself in those same exact shoes as Dr. Mike. You find yourself in the place where you're like, "I've tried everything else. I've tried to numb it. I've tried to solve it on my own. I've tried to get people to help me with it. I've tried to go and find relationships. I've tried to relationally get over it, and I can't do anything about it." And this is where many of us will find ourselves today. See, God isn't silent on the issue of pain. Easter, in fact, is God's response to humanity's deepest pain. One of Jesus' final statements lays a framework for how we're to understand and experience pain. Jesus says, "My God, why?" And instead of looking inward or looking outward, Jesus, in fact, he just turns his head and he looks upward. Even the Son of God looked upward. Look with me at the rest of the story here. It says that when Jesus had cried out in a loud voice, he gave up his spirit. He cried out in this loud voice. Jesus gave up his spirit. In this moment, Jesus put all his pain, all his hurt, all of his anguish into the hands of God the Father and said, "I trust you. I give you my spirit. I give you my pain." See, here's what Jesus was doing. He was suffering what history has called the most excruciatingly painful way to die. He hung on the cross, suffering unjustly. And he cries out, "God, why?" And yet, in that same moment, in that same breath, he still trusts the Father. He trusts God. He says, "I've been torn, I've been judged, I've been tortured by this cruel and sinful world, but Father, I still trust you." If any of you said in this room, "Hey, you know what, Peter, like maybe out on the field later when the eggs are dropping, or if we were to meet over a cup of coffee or something," you look across the table at me and say, "You know what, Peter, you have no idea what I'm going through. You have no idea what it feels like." I would say that you're right. Why are you in pain? I don't know. But I do know that God knows what pain is. Jesus understands what pain is. He went through it. He endured the cross. He experienced tremendous pain. He knows it all too well. But God didn't stop there by just knowing what pain is. That's not good enough. Because it's never good enough to just have someone say, "Oh, I know how you feel," pat you on the back and send you on your way, right? Like, that never is going to ever cover it. See, God went even further than that. See, back in Matthew chapter 27, it says that at that moment, the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. The earth shook and the rocks split. "God, why? Why are you in pain?" I don't know. But I do know that God abandoned his son, Jesus, on the cross in his pain so that he won't ever have to abandon you in yours. See, God hasn't left us without hope. Because in that moment when Jesus breathed out his last, he cried out, he said, "I give you my spirit." At that moment, that temple curtain was just torn right in half. The thing that separated us from God, the presence of God, was now wide open for everybody to experience. Everybody is able to be in God's presence. See, God knew it wasn't good enough to just say, "I know how you feel." God was going to say, "I will be with you as you feel. I'll be with you in the doctor's office. I'll be with you on your last day as you're packing your office. I will be with you when you're going through your divorce. I will be with you during that screening. I'll walk with you in your time of abandonment. You will never be alone in your pain." And unlike those priests who had to kind of go in and clean themselves up and get everything together, there's nothing that you have to do. You don't have to clean yourself up. You don't have to dress anyway. Listen, if you come back next week, it's going to look a little bit different. I did this for a few of you, the jacket and all that stuff. You don't have to get dressed up to be in God's presence. In fact, you don't even need to go anywhere. On the cross, God tore the divide. He broke the separation. God didn't abandon his son so that you won't face pain. God abandoned his son so that you won't face pain alone. On the cross, the son was torn from the Father so that the curtain separating you from God would be torn. God may never take away your pain, but he'll never take away his presence from you either. I know this is the point in time where some of you are like, listen, dude, I only came because my kids need to have an Easter experience and there's a helicopter and this is the coolest thing going, and I agree with you. But I believe that today God has something for you, something that you may not even have come knowing about. You may not have showed up here thinking this is why you were here. But there's this great quote by C.S. Lewis, and he says this: God whispers in our pleasures. He speaks in our conscience, but he shouts in our pain. It's his megaphone to rouse a deaf world. In pain, you and I learn what we could never experience in comfort. All of our senses are heightened. And the question is, will you use your heightened sensitivity to turn inward or upward? This morning at Hope City, we say this quite a bit. We say that we are for Sarasota. You've seen it probably in some of our hallways and stuff. We're for Sarasota because we believe that God is for Sarasota. We exist to make this community a better place. We believe that following Jesus with your life will do an incredible thing in your life and in the life of our community. And so here in Sarasota, we've recognized that there's a group of people that wake up every single day and they wonder, has God forgotten about me? They wonder, is it possible for me to experience God? See, in our county, in Sarasota County, we've recognized that there are 1,600 foster care children. Kids who wonder, why has this happened to me? Why am I moving from house to house, place to place? Has God forgotten about me? Is this drawn in front of me? And at Hope City, we want to do something about that. See, this Easter, we're partnering with an organization called The Twig. It's a nonprofit organization that exists to inspire and encourage the lives of children in foster care. And here's how they do that. Every month, foster care kids are allowed to show up to their place, and they're given a bag very similar to this. And this bag, then they're sent into this clothing boutique to pick out 7 items of their choosing, their liking. Like it's not a hand-me-down bag here, it's pre-filled, it's maybe your size, like figure it out. No, they get to go through and find things that they feel comfortable and look good in. And so they choose 7 items of their choosing for free. And then in addition to that, every child gets a new bag of socks and a new bag of underwear. So what kind of a difference could this make, you ask? Well, did you know that every day in our county, 2 children are added to the foster care system? And that 50% of foster care children who make it through the foster care system aren't adopted out along the way, they won't graduate high school, 50%. And 25% of them will end up homeless by the time that they're 22. We need to do something about this. We need to reassure people that the curtain has been torn, that God has not forgotten about you, and this is a group of people that we care about desperately here. So what kind of a difference could we possibly make? Well, I went to the Twig the other day, and I asked them, I go, hey, so what's your greatest need? She took me into the back storeroom, and she showed me these 3 bins. Look at this. 3 bins. It says men's small, men's medium, men's large. She goes, that's our socks and underwear bins. Completely empty. She said, we have nothing right now. And so I said, oh, I think I know some people who can help me with that. We together can make a difference for Sarasota. And so you'll notice these bins are empty, but what if we did something about that? See, God tore the wall that separated us from him, and we want to do anything that we can to make sure that an overlooked group of people feel cared for by God and by us. And so what I want to do is I want to invite our ushers to come forward. We've got these bags for you. We're calling them bags of hope. There's a tag on them. If you guys, what we're going to do is we're going to collect socks and underwear, new socks, new underwear, boys and girls, small through large, and we would love for you to bring this bag back filled next week. And so we've got one bag per family. Just somebody in your family, slip up your hand, and then we'll give you one of these bags. And this is a way for us to partner with our city to make a difference, to help remind them that the temple curtain has been torn, that God is for them, that we're for Sarasota. See, new socks, new underwear can be a breath of fresh air to a kid. To a kid that's been experiencing like their toes jammed up and 3 sizes too small, or they only left with the clothes that were on their back. And they wake up every day wondering, has God forgotten about me? Guys, we can make a difference. You can make a difference. We've got these bags of hope because we believe that hope makes a difference. But this morning, some of you carried a bag like that in yourself. And the bag was filled with pain. It was filled with heartache. It was filled with hopelessness. And some of you woke up this morning asking the question, God, why? But see, on Easter, this is a day when we celebrate that God has torn the curtain wide open. The curtain that separated us from Him is wide open. Easter is a day that we're reassured of our hope that we have in Christ. Easter is a day when Jesus came back to life, defeating death and sin, so that you and I could have hope. And I wonder, what could God breathe new life into your world today? What could come back to life in your place? See, on Easter Sunday, those disciples woke up and they were headed to a tomb where they expected to see a cold and lifeless body in a decaying grave. But God had different plans, because on Easter Sunday, the tomb was empty. Jesus wasn't there. God had a different idea. On one of the darkest days of history, God's light was the brightest. And some of you feel like you're stuck in Friday. But let me tell you, today's Sunday. God has risen. Jesus has rose from the dead. You and I, we can have hope that in the midst of the most painful situation, we can endure it because Jesus lives.